Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading property experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, and Ben Kingsley, Chair of Property Investment Professionals of Australia and the 2014 and 2015 Property Investment Advisor of the Year.
All right, folks, you're on the Property Couch, where each week Ben and I bring you the Insider's Guide, but this week, Ben,
Newsflash.
we're going to bring a special edition, aren't we?
We are.
And it's not because Fremantle and Collingwood finally had a win.
But we didn't just have a win, mate. You knocked off the reigning premiers.
Well spotted.
And we knocked off the
By
bloody
point.
runners-up.
By point. Could have gone either way.
Oh, I'll take it. It's better than, 1 point the other way. To draw, we get 2 points. 4 points
So
on the
we're
board.
We're up and about. 4 points each. Hey, mate, I saw a movie last night, and if it wasn't, if you weren't grateful that you lived in this country, watch Land of Mines.
Oh, okay.
Mate, they had 2,000 German prisoner of war. They had these teenage kids that they sent out to the beach in Denmark, because the Germans had put all these 40,000 landmines on the beach. Oh, so they made the prisoner of war dismantle each and every one of them. And these boys, they were teenagers, mate, and it was unbelievable.
Yeah, very lucky.
So we are incredibly fortunate.
But it's obviously, that's the crazy stuff that's going on in the world at the moment. So, we've got some important stuff to talk about here. That's why we thought we'd do this bone episode.
Say that again. What are we doing?
Bone episode. Newsflash.
What are we going to do it on?
We're talking about some of the big stuff that's going on around lending.
Yes.
And then also around some of the proposals that might be coming out from the government around super and property.
Yeah.
So all linked back into the biggest topic at the moment, housing affordability.
So just think Mike Tyson with Evander Holyfield, he had a punched up face and, bruises, and that's what any property investor, that's what they look like now.
We're
done a few rounds.
Eighth, I reckon when they're eighth, but it could be a 15-round bout. So, okay. So anyway, this is what we're about.
Mate, if I know you well enough from previous experience, you are about to fire up.
I'm going to try and keep it in check, because it's not nothing's policy yet. It's all just being debated out in the community, but there is definitely some stuff going on around lending, and that's what I want to talk to.
So there's a couple of agendas here today on our podcast, because we have a lot of our clients who listen to the podcast. So we're sending a message to them about money smarts. But we're also sending a message to our community of people on the Property Couch on some of these big things. So where do you want to start, mate?
Look, I'm just going to read out some latest data from CoreLogic, just basically on the Australia's wealth in households. So here's the data from February 2017. Currently, residential real estate, they value it at around $6.9 trillion. Now, at the moment, we currently have mortgage debt outstanding at around $1.62 trillion. Which, so if we looked at a global LVR of all of our residential property, we're talking a global LVR of 23.48% loan to value ratio. Okay, so that's simply dividing 1.62 trillion over 6.9 trillion. Now, to put that into perspective, superannuation 2.2 trillion, listed Australian stocks on the stock exchange 1.7 trillion, commercial real estate $0.92 trillion. Number of dwellings currently sits at around 9.7 million dwellings. And then if we talk about the percentage of household wealth held in housing is 51.6%.
Right.
Okay, so it is one of our best saving vehicles that we've ever had in terms of being able to build wealth. And that's probably where I want to start in terms of, we are right down in the detail, and we're going to get down in the detail in a minute. But I want to talk about this concept that we live in a really lucky country. We've got some of the best standard of living. We've got some of the highest wealth per capita on the planet. And I think we need to be mindful of that, because as a capitalist economy, even though we do have some really strong social fabric in our capitalist plays, we need to be mindful that anything that we're doing in terms of playing with these levers can have consequences, and they can have very big consequences in regards to housing value underpins everything around us in terms of our confidence, in terms of jobs. So just to give you an idea, direct jobs in construction alone represents 9% of our total workforce. So it has by far been the reason why we have remained out of a recession, because of this shift from capital works in the mining sector into basically this building boom that we've been enjoying. Now, part of that has been obviously home buyers, investors, foreign investors as well, because they're getting punched up a bit at the moment as well, to drive that. And we're seeing record number of dwellings growth. So our supply side is getting better. Our pipeline of supply is getting better. But also the reason why values have grown so much is because demand that's been underpinned by that has grown so substantially over a short period of time with record low interest rates that we've got this peak in our cycle right now. And that's why the regulators are now starting to looking to do more about that. Now, it's very sensitive, Bryce, because what you can't do is create a contagion or a flow-on effect around what's going to happen with values. When you do create that contagion effect, again, what I've mentioned before, it's delicate. So it's almost at the moment that property investors, I've been using this statement, it's death by 1,000 cuts at the moment. They just want to basically slow us down, and that has some logic to it. We talked about this before. It's absolutely unsustainable that there's 50% or more of people buying investment properties. It cannot last forever. So the media attention of late around house prices slowing, Moody's coming out with CoreLogic's data and saying that there's going to be a correction in some markets. That's all good news for softening sentiment and softening broader confidence that everyone thinks that, as you rightly put it, mate, it's a bricks and mortar bank account. And so we know that not every property makes for a good investment property. We've been talking about this for a long time, and there's going to be a lot of red ink on some people's balance sheets, and they're going to be buying these properties in bad areas. And so, this is coming, and we've been warning about this. So APRA's moves is where I want to go. So let's talk to that.
Yeah, the Mortgage Business reports that APRA's written to authorised deposit-taking institutions on some further measures around investment lending. Number one, limit the flow of new interest-only lending to 30% of total new residential mortgage lending, and within that, place strict internal limits on the volume of interest-only lending at LVRs above 80%.
Yep.
And to ensure there is strong scrutiny and justification of any instances of interest-only lending at an LVR above 90%. That's one. Two, manage lending to investors in such a manner so as to comfortably remain below the previously advised benchmark of 10% growth. Three, review and ensure that serviceability metrics, including interest rate and net income buffers, are set at appropriate levels for current conditions. And four, continue to restrain lending growth in high risk segments of the portfolio, i.e. what we talked about for high LVR and loans for very long terms.
So let's break these down. Let's start with the first one. So the first one again was
the lending ratios at
interest only,
30%.
Yeah. So at the moment, we go back through some of the data, and the data's not fantastic out of the banks at the moment. We've seen ASIC have been doing a review around mortgage lending and mortgage broking and commissions, and we've seen some data come out from those reviews as well. Now, what we do know is that I think it was about 2008, 2010, around 30% of all new lending was interest only, okay? And that's moved to 40. They'd like to see that go back to around 30. Now, you and I both know we have a Money Smarts system, and we have strongly advocated on many a podcast about having interest-only lending across all of your lending, but that was back in the time where it was priced accordingly. So there wasn't a penalty or a disparity between having principal and interest only. Now, we are huge advocates of being in control of your cash flow, okay, and having access to your cash reserves in your control, which is the use of an offset account. So it's very important to understand that's why we're doing it. And in terms of the modelling that we do for our clients, so when I'm talking to our clients, that reserve of hundreds of thousands of dollars that are built over, and in some cases almost $1 million that might be sitting in an offset versus $1 million in debt is actually used in some cases to fund retirement as opposed to paying off the debt. So it's a very sophisticated way of managing how you would look after funding that retirement until potentially your super kicks in. Because right now, when we do 40-year projections, 50-year projections for our clients, there is going to be some changes to superannuation, and we'll get to that later in the podcast. But so
it helps people get access to their balance sheet.
Yeah.
In times, you just think back to the GFC. Instead of going begging cap in hand, you actually just had control of your cash, and in those times you have access. So effectively, that's the overarching context of that strategy, isn't it?
Correct.
So that people don't have to
consequences.
beg.
That's right. The consequences weren't that you were paying any more interest because the money was sitting in your offset. But now, obviously, and this is the. When I look at our clients and how we train them and coach them and how we're teaching you on the podcast how to look after money, we may have been, too successful. And so the problem that we've got here is that APRA and the regulators are seeing a swell in interest-only lending, and they're making an assumption that everyone is basically borrowing too much to go and buy that McMansion, and they're realising that the difference between interest only and a P&I loan per month could be literally $500-$600. And so that's how they justify pay the price to get into the market. So if anyone is doing that, that is, you're being done with money.
You are, and because you're also assuming that it will always go up, because half the reason you want to do that is because you think, well, because I can get on the ladder, I've got minimal payments, and then the increase in the value will compensate for that. But as Ross Greenwood said during the week, property market's a market. It goes up and it goes down.
Yeah.
And this overarching confidence that it's always going to go up will, those people you're just talking about.
It's not going to happen.
Will be vulnerable.
It's impossible. It's impossible for markets to continue to keep growing right across the board. It just doesn't happen. So if you're listening to us and you are thinking about justifying to buy a house to live in, or an investment property, and you absolutely need every cent of that interest-only component to be the cash flow management to buy at that high price point, don't buy it. Right? We cannot stress that highly enough. Do not buy it. The same thing, the offset money is absolute buffer money. So we keep that in reserve. So we at the very minimum, and we've talked about this before, we have a 6-month minimum where that cash flow buffer can change. Ideally, we want 3 years, 5 years of buffer. So that just buys you time if there is some type of correction in the market. These people who are doing that, and so I can understand why the regulators are getting concerned, these people who are potentially stretching themselves, that's concerning about the structural confidence in the market. If there are literally thousands upon thousands of people doing this in the outer suburbs to get into their new house and land packages, that's really concerning. But that then links into us, Bryce, in terms of what are we advising people who have adopted our money smarts, and for our clients who are listening as well right now, what does that mean for them in regards to should they change their position? And we've had internal discussions around that with all of our senior leaders in the different divisions of our business. We've got our mortgage division and also our property wealth planning division, and our financial planning division. And we've come to the conclusion that it's going to be a case-by-case basis. Okay, so at the moment, the differential between interest only and P&I on owner-occupied lending is ranging between 15 basis points and maybe 22 basis points. Now, for some people, that is a cost that they don't want to incur. That's straight to the bank's bottom line. So from that point of view, you may choose to explore the idea of principal and interest on your principal place of residence, okay? And if you do that, that's great. If you're in the accumulation phase, though, just be mindful of the separation of the loss that you will have in that extra cash flow. Now, if this is APRA's means to sort of, again, death by 1,000 cuts, slow down the appetite for bricks and mortar real estate, we get it. But if you are a more sophisticated or in a better financial position with really strong surplus cash flows, you may determine that that's a cost of doing business. So again, we're not going to come out and say this is a one size fits all. It's going to be a case by case. That then leads into further exploring what they're doing around slowing down investor lending. Okay, so the investor lending piece is this concept of just wean investors off the market for a while, and they're doing that by, again, putting a premium on what you would pay on your investment loans and also the investment interest only loan. So why do we go interest only on an investment property? Because effectively the main reason you're doing that is because you want to effectively get the best result for your property portfolio, and that could be putting money against your non-deductible mortgage. In other words, even though we put it in the offset account, we're effectively paying off that principal home, which just happens to be non-deductible debt. So if our dominant purpose is to build up our war chest to effectively neutralise our mortgage on our house, our home, then ultimately that's a good strategy. So you would then pay down your investor debt over time. And again, how we do that is by building money in offset buckets, okay, at the start. Now, if we get to 65 or 70, ultimately what's going to be the case is we should have enough, the debt should be all paid off. In a sense, we're paying no, and certainly when your global portfolio, and we've said this many a time, is sitting between sort of, at the moment with really low interest rates, if your global portfolio is sitting at around 65% loan to value ratio, you'll be cash flow positive. If your global as rates go up, if your global portfolio sits at around 55 to 60, you're normally going to be cash flow positive. So if you've got your global portfolio to 25%, so there's still 25% residual debt there, you're going to be cash flow positive. So you can have a choice to either sell a property or completely pay off all of those loans and start living off that passive income, grab access to some of your super if you wish to be able to do that as well.
I think one of the things to think about too, Ben, do you know how you talked about the 6.9 trillion and the 1.62? So our LVR is quite low globally. It doesn't tell the true story though, does it? Because the vulnerable group are the people that have come into the market in the last 10 years, because you've got a low debt against the value, but that's previous generations who quite often own their own homes. So that's the challenge that the regulators face, isn't it? That anything that they do, if you look at paper, go, whenever you go through a financial crisis like we did in 2008, your vulnerability is if you've got too much debt. So if you look at the balance sheet for Australia, the debt looks pretty good. But it's within the, as we talk about, there's no one market, there's no one household. As we go down to those people who have bought in the last cycle, they are very, very vulnerable, which sort of talks about the next point that APRA talks about too, is that they want to review and ensure those serviceability metrics. They service in the medium term, not just the short term as well. And that's probably one of the things that can take a bit of steam out of the investor market, isn't it? Because if they improve those assessment rates and lift those up on paper assessment rates,
totally,
that'll remove a whole heap of borrowing capacity.
Oh, they could have been ruthless in this regard. They could have turned around and said for investment purchases, rather than having a standard 2% or 2.5% assessment rate, they could have said a 3.5% assessment rate. Now, that effectively means for any borrower who's got multiple properties, they're out of the game. The banks will not lend them another cent. So those borrowers either need to find alternative funding sources outside of ADIs, basically deposit-taking institutions. So if they did that, and that's obviously putting some risk into the marketplace as well. So we were fortunate that APRA are smart enough and the RBA are smart enough to know that we need to, wean off as opposed to just rip them straight off the bosom and effectively do that. So this has been sensible policy to date, and I suspect the levers that they keep pulling or tightening, the braking that they're doing, will continue on a slow and steady until they get that balance right for the current environment.
What about, speaking to the final point here, Ben, just restraining the lending growth in that higher risk segments of the portfolio. So we've already seen a bit of that where they've, anything with a higher 90% plus, that's been going for a little while, but that's probably smart.
I think it is sensible.
That takes a speculator out.
Correct. We don't want 95, 100% lending across markets. Now, if you've got equity in your home and, you might have a loan to value ratio on your current home of 25%, well, gearing up a bit of that equity is sensible, and putting that potentially against your investment property to have all of your deductible debt all structured correctly, we think that's prudent and sensible approach. In terms of global portfolios, if you're very young, in very strong, a couple of doctors or something like that, and you haven't been able to save up that deposit yet, you've obviously got your parents who can potentially help you. They can help you buy an investment property as well as help you buy a home. So there are alternative means that we've been talking about, because if you've really got that strong surplus and job security is really strong for you, then you shouldn't have to wait. But it's certainly for those people who might be in industries that could suffer from technology and innovation changes, or general labouring work and those type of things, where you are more at risk of cyclical change in the economy. They're the types of people that we would be saying it's time to be a bit prudent and just keep building up a deposit, because you might have some great buying opportunities in the next 2 or 3 years. But for those others who are ready to go. Now, Bryce, did you know that the ABS released some of the new census data in the last 48 hours?
Yeah. Well, they drip feed a bit, but mate, a bit early for you. Did you know?
Yeah, I know. So we have seen sort of the typical person changing in Australia, which has been interesting. So I haven't had enough time to put a huge amount of work into it, but what I can talk about
Bernard
is...
Salt, when he almost described my wife, the 2 kids, the 38-year-old, 2 cars, Anglo-Saxon female.
But it comes back to your point about where the household debt is, because we are getting higher and higher household debt, but I suspect that's partly because of the immigration story of these people arriving, and that is fantastic. I mean, there's 5,000 people turning 65 a day at the moment, right, in Australia. So that we had this ageing problem. We needed to bring a young workforce in that can potentially continue to make the economy thrive, because if it thrives, it means we get the tax receipts from it to help fund those people in their pension phase. So it's really important that we did that, because if we just stopped that immigration, we would be in all manner of strife in terms of being able to fund our pensioners, to fund our medical commitments. We're very blessed with the way in which we're able to look after most people in this country.
So Ben, just a few takeaways for the listeners on the Money Smart. So, and of course, seek local professional advice. This is very general in nature. So there's no blanket. So whether you go interest only or P&I, it's case by case. Cash flows have always told the story and will always continue to tell the story. So that still remains as to whether you would switch between interest only and the opportunity cost, depending on which phase you're at. But I guess a summary is that the Money Smarts won't work for every Australian.
No.
And ultimately, it's people that do have good cash flows, who have good discipline and can work past the headline and the noise, versus the people who might be a bit vulnerable, which we talked about.
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the things we've got to be mindful when we do have those interest-only periods, we're usually, we've in the past advocated for rolling them over 5 by 5 by 5. If we start to see this change in terms of lender appetite and tightening of servicing, there will be people who are thinking that, I've been able to do my portfolio based on interest only, and then all of a sudden there's this massive amount of P&I debt that we're going to have to service. So fortunately for hopefully a lot of those people that we've been looking after, they've had property price growth. So the worst case scenario for them, they cash out and make a profit, right? But if they simply can't get refinanced into a better option. But of course, as a business like ours, we are looking for alternatives. We are hopefully ahead of the bell curve in terms of looking at ways. But we've had people just recently come into our business saying, I'm stuffed. I wanted to speak to your investment savvy mortgage broker. Here's my situation. I've got 5 loans rolling out of interest only, and I haven't factored in, that the banks wouldn't be able to give me some more. So we're working through those clients to look at different alternatives. They are getting harder and harder to find, but also when we see these types of corrections happening, and we're going to pick on the banks now a little bit, but they're obviously, in some cases, they're doing business with one hand behind their back because APRA's put a speed limit on them with their 10%. But so they're to compensate that, they're putting margin. And again, APRA's decision to talk about the banks getting in a stronger fiscal position. So the head of APRA is basically saying, yep, your balance sheet looks really good because of the equity and all of the assets that that are underpinned by, i.e. all those residential properties, but we want you to have a little bit more cash in reserve. So you've got to go and raise another $15 billion. Well, that gives the banks a little bit of extra to sort of say, well, that's good, because they know what APRA know and the RBA know what the banks are then going to do. They can come to the market and say,
pass it on.
Yeah, look, the cost of funding, it's increasing. We have to hold more reserves, so we're going to put rates up. And so that is a very clever behind-the-scenes approach in which APRA and the RBA can then also give them the lever to actually drop interest rates. So if jobs growth starts to get sluggish into the second half of this year, given that there's basically all these speed limits being put on borrowing for residential property at the moment, that potentially will give the RBA the ability to drop the cash rate, and that will help business because obviously the cost of funds for business will be cheaper. So it's an interesting time, and that's why we're not blanketly coming out and saying that we know the answer for every client at the moment. That's why it's case by case.
Yeah, but ultimately, I mean, it's not sustainable to have a property going up 20 grand a week. It's
crazy.
We're in the market, we're missing out on, lots of properties, like everyone else. Because we've set a limit and we've also comped it up from the week before. And but if your property's going up $20,000 a week, it may feel good. But, if we got I think, was it your analogy where, maybe it was something else, where you're blowing up the balloon, and you don't want the pin to you want to just, when you got your kid, you want to let a little bit out, so that...
that was a sound effect coming out of his mouth, by the way.
So, for those people that are just want this speculative, making money every weekend to keep happening, it feels good in the short term, but it's not sustainable.
And for those people who feel like they absolutely need to get in now, right across the Australian market, be the borderless investor. There are some great buying opportunities elsewhere, but I would be very careful in terms of being in the Sydney market at the moment, and also quite specialised in the Melbourne market in terms of what I'm looking. In fact, after this recording, we go straight into an investment committee meeting about locations that we're buying and the reasons why we buy. So this is serious stuff. I mean, we play with people's lives here, and we obviously want to get the best result for everyone that we look after, and so do any professionals who hopefully are out there, unless they're not true professionals and they're all about themselves. So I reckon that's a good way to finish that.
Yeah, I agree. So I was just going to say, for those listeners, just to remember, the analogy of be a farmer, not a hunter. So
I love it.
The farmer thinks multi-season. They plant now to reap later. So if you're a farmer, and I'm talking about you're in this game in 2017, you want to still be there in 2027. Don't get overly concerned by the headline. Make sure that asset selection is right. But I remember, even back when I first got involved, Ben, they removed negative gearing in 83. They brought it back in 85 in a hurry, and they gave you huge depreciation incentives to get the investor back in. I remember when I was helping property investors buy property prior to the introduction of the GST, nearly every property, in fact, every property that we would suggest was cash flow positive. And then all of a sudden, I remember at the time, we were doing the numbers. Once the tax rates changed when the GST came in, all of a sudden someone had to pay $11 a week out of their pocket, which at the time seemed like a fortune. But we thought that everything was going to fall out of the property market. Ed Chan used to always say, for as long as people need to adjust in their seat, every time they sit down, if they're uncomfortable, they move around and they'll adjust in their seat to get more comfortable. So too will the property market. So if you're a farmer, you'll be fine. If you're a hunter and you've done some of those things we talked about, high LVRs, you've hocked yourself to the eyeballs, you don't have any margin in your cash flow whatsoever, they're the people that should really take heed to this message today.
I totally agree. I mean, and we talked about we want clients to, and any investor to have a product in Melbourne or Sydney at some point in their journey. Really smart to have that in their portfolio. But sometimes the smartest investment decision is to do nothing at all. Is to sit on your hands and have faith that the cycle will turn, and then the buying opportunities will come. And for us, we've been doing this for over 20 years, both of us. So we know that there will be cyclical change and there will be buying opportunities. So we're well versed on when we know we're going to go into the Sydney market in a strong way, but we'll continue to look for these other opportunities using the metrics and the measurements that we use in identifying areas that we would be buying today.
Speculators beware. Investors just have a level head. Renovators should have on their radar, if they're flippers, Ben, that if they do tweak the capital gains tax legislation, and they do change some of those exemptions you get on capital gains tax, that may impact them. So
there is definitely a possibility that there may be, this. We want to get speculators out of the market. So the best way to do that is potentially have a sort of a yearly trigger, and so if you're speculating, you might have 90% of the value gain might be contributed to your income for that year in the first couple of years, then 25%, and then back to 50. I mean, because the reason why it was changed initially was the fact that it was an indexing rule, And so they basically to keep it simple, they just said basically 50%, thinking that people will hold properties for 15 or 20 years.
And at the time, it was also to help us become globally competitive as a marketplace to attract funds, wasn't it?
Correct,
Because
yeah.
we weren't that competitive as an investment place to park our funds.
2/3 of our income is derived from services. Right, so that's our GDP, right? So we export. I think we create or export in terms of our agriculture. 2/3 of the food that we make goes offshore, right? So, but that's why we need the bigger population. That's why subtly, even though it's politically a difficult thing to talk about, we absolutely need these people to come in, because if we don't do that, we don't manufacture much. So ultimately, people need jobs, and part of that jobs is construction, those types of things. And that's sort of semi-manufacturing, but it's really services, and then the retail that flows on from that. So it's really important to understand that is, that'll have some scrutiny over the course of the next few years as well, in terms of what looks like there. So if you are going to be a flipper and those types of things, you may have to go into the business of that, as opposed to it's currently classed as a hobby business. There might have to be changes, and you might have to start paying GST and a few other things.
Very good. Lucky the listeners get to listen to the Property Investment Advisor of the Year, mate, because you've got some incredible wisdom, and I think that people should heed the advice that you're giving them. Super.
So this is the big topic of the week. It's everywhere on the airwaves at the moment. We're starting to see some people in the Liberal Party are getting behind it, other people aren't getting behind it. So I want to start macro here, and I want to basically start long term. So what we're talking about here is there needs to be a psychological shift in terms of how we look at the journey of life. Geez, where'd that come from?
Oh,
Psychological shift from the
Aren't you
journey.
normally saying that to me?
Mate,
Mindset Minute?
Right. So we know that, and we've talked about this before, but pensions were developed, I think, by the French originally, and it was sort of the last basically 1 or 2 years before they died. So they worked until they died, and then they, and it was adopted because everyone thought, well, that's a reasonable social aspect to it. Thanks for working really hard to grow the country, and here's a couple of years. Obviously, the Australian government realised in the early 90s that we had a problem around people living longer. So at the time, 60 was the retirement age, and people were going to, they were forecast to live to around 70, 75. So they were like, oh my God, how are we going to fund these people for 10 or 15 years? When they can't even manage their own balance sheet at home, we need to introduce forced savings. So super is our money, it's forced savings. So, it had its resistance, but good on Paul Keating and Hawke and everyone who got, and I think it was a bilateral. I think the Liberals thought it was a smart idea as well. They saw the reasoning behind it. So fast track to 2017, and now we're going to live to 100. And in fact, probably the next 2 generations are going to live indefinitely, because they're going to change their physical body into some type of android type thing. Anyway, that's a story for another day.
Is that because of the paleo diet?
yeah. It's all of those little seeds that everyone has to eat for antioxidants or something. Anyway, we're getting healthier, we're getting smarter. We're going to fix things like dementia and all of those things. There will be medical breakthroughs that will make us live longer. So whilst we're having this conversation, everyone's still talking about retiring at 60 or 65. So we haven't moved that conversation on to a more broader conversation around, what? My grandparents, when they were 60, they looked old. They worked hard. It was physical.
Labour.
It was, it was hard work, and they didn't have the same type of diets and all of these wonderful things. That's why Bryce is going to live to 214 because he keeps eating that grass. All very good. No, but the point I'm making there is that we need to start having a conversation. The problem is that, mate, it's very politically sensitive.
Can't tell someone going to work longer than 60, can you?
How can you tell the Australian society that you're going to basically... The French went on strike, mate. They tried to move it from, I think it was 55 to 60, and there was there was like a week. No one worked for a week.
Isn't that ironic? You're going to work longer, we'll go on strike.
Oh, it's great. So it's a very politically difficult topic to talk through. But if we actually think about it and say... we're going to live longer, and we're going to be healthier when we are 70 or 75. That's going to be the new 65. So we're still going to be able to jump out of planes. We're still going to be able to go on our river cruises. We're still going to be able to do all of the fun things that we want to do in terms of our bucket list. So this idea, taking a long-term view of saying to people for their first 10 or 15 years, that the money that they're putting away, the 9.5% or 10% that they're putting away now, can be used to fund a house, is not a bad thing when you think about the actual benefits we get from higher household wealth through growing property prices. So the idea is, back in, say, the 1990s or the 2000s, when we thought we were going to retire earlier or retire at 60 or 65, we effectively had 30, 35 years of working. And so the modelling that the super industry have done, it says, it's still not enough. It's not, and it's true, it's not going to be enough if you want to have a very, very comfortable standard of living. But what if you are going to live longer? There's going to be a small percentage, and hopefully they're the people we're helping, that are going to be able to retire a little bit earlier or retire at 60 or 65. But for the mass population, and we're talking about broader Australians, which is what the government has to attend to here, who may not even have an interest in building sizable wealth for future choices in life. These people, if they know that the first 10 or 15 years of their lifespan is going to be about saving the deposit or a portion of that to get them into a property, and they have a choice to do that, they continue to rent, and then they basically have super, which is what's happened in Europe. Most people are opting for their pension schemes and building up their wealth, but renting. And that's just a cost of how they do it. So there's 50-50 home ownership here. It's 70-30, probably sneaking down to maybe 67, 33, whatever it looks like. So for me, it's like, if we can change that mind shift to sort of say, because the fact of the matter is, people are kidding themselves if they think that they can retire at 65 and they're going to have enough wealth to look after them for 30 or 40 years. It's just not possible. They might downsize, and that could give them a little bit of an uplift. But the broader economy, we know that only 5% of people are going to retire wealthy. So from that point of view, I actually don't mind conceptually. Now, I understand the challenges, so let's get into those.
Well, because the challenge is, if you give, two things. The people who need it the most are the younger generation, who generally don't have a very high balance in their super fund.
Correct.
So they wouldn't even be able to take out enough to cover the stamp duty. But let's assume they do. I just think that it just brings more demand to the situation. So say they can get an extra 50K out. I just feel, if across the board, that just increases the market by 50K, because ultimately it probably just means they'll turn up at auction with their extra 50K that they didn't have before. They might not end up buying it, but the person who did had to pay 50 grand extra to get it. So I don't know that it's the panacea. I'm of the view that it might not be the panacea.
No, I'm certainly saying it's not the panacea, but I'm saying it's very hard for families and households to actually manage their money. We can see that right now. So if this is a forced
isn't that
savings
counterintuitive? If they don't manage their money well, we give it to them now, and then they get to that down the timeline, and they've mismanaged it for the last 40 years, and then all of a sudden they still don't have any, isn't it?
Well, at least they've got bricks and mortar behind them. So if we get them into a property, that is the best forced savings.
If they don't have a gambling problem or...
Yeah, but we're being on extremities. But it's a two-prong approach here. You can have a big deposit, but if you don't have the servicing capability, you still can't buy the property. Do you know what I mean? Like, you still have it. Your limit is your servicing, your borrowing power. It's not your deposit. So it doesn't automatically then push prices up by that set amount that the couple or the single is going to bring to the table. But I do think there needs to be some type of mechanism that we control that level of demand coming in. So it might be that if you want to buy a house before 30, you can't access it. And if you want to buy a house after 40, it's capped at $50,000 or whatever it might be. So it's just trying to say that, at some point, yes, we do want you to save for your future, but guess what? We still don't trust you. So that's why you've got super, all right? And the super industries are going to be up in arms. How do you? Hey, wake up, Australia! It's actually each of those persons' money. It's not your money, government. It's not our money. It's the household's money. It's that person's money. And if it's to buy something that longer term is going to be a sensible asset that's appreciating in value, which lifts the Australian economy, lifts our standard of living, lifts our household wealth, which underpins everything that we're about as a society, then I think that, through sensible levers, they may be able to introduce that over the short to medium term.
There's an obvious caveat that needs to go in here, don't you? They have to only be available to Property Couch listeners, because what if they weren't, and they went and bought an off-the-plan apartment with that $50,000? They'd be in all sorts of strife. No, it's not simple.
No, but this is just another tool in the toolkit that governments can look at, and I think when we think about it sensibly, if we are going to, I come back to, if I was working from 20 to 65, what's that, 45 years? If I'm working from 30 to 75, what's that, 45 years? So I should still have enough time to make sure that I'm not just thinking of the house, but I'm also putting some money aside for retirement. And, what will be a big thing into the future is some type of annuity. But the other thing too, and this is where I'm going to have a go at, politicians.
No.
That super, mate, the reason why we want to get it out of super is because we don't trust the government in terms of what they're going to do with it, to keep making changes to it. So I think if you gave, the government wants that money because they can tinker with it, and it's not politically, dynamite when they do that, because people it's only bloody super. Okay, but I'm worried about.
A lot of people don't connect to the super being their money.
No,
even though it is, they don't connect to it.
No, it's ridiculous. And so for me, it's and we talked about this before. You connect with that super. Go and get it working well for you. Go and get, have a look at what you're investing in, because that is your money. And if you have poor returns on that, it's not going to be a big nest egg. If you have great returns on it, it's going to be hopefully a good nest egg as well. So, for me, it's just about, okay, this is another mechanism. I'm still a huge believer in, fast rail. I'm still there, from an affordability point of view, nothing other than nation building new cities or connecting bigger cities like Albury, Shepparton, Goulburn, those types of centres is absolute game changer. So, and that will spread and diversify our population base, which in the long run will make housing affordability a lot better for all, and people can live in some beautiful, beautiful country areas of our fine nation.
There you go, listeners. Send an email to Scott Morrison. Where's the train?
Where's
the train? Question mark.
Where's the
hashtag
train?
Where's the train?
Yeah, where's the hashtag? Where's the train?
Yeah,
very good.
Very good. So, mate, I think we've covered off a fair bit here.
Yes.
I think in this special episode, but closing word from the chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia. What's the message that you want to get across in all of this atmosphere of change to banking policy and to try and move the sentiment out of the investor market?
So it's be sensible, be prudent, understand that some of the smartest decisions are no action at all in some markets. And from the chairman's point of view, for all of our professional people who work in the industry, we want a sustainable industry. So if we don't have this sort of weaning off approach that we've got at the moment, then the consequences could be far worse, and that could put in jeopardy people's ability to look at households, residential property as an investment class asset. So from my point of view, it's all about sustainability and playing the long game, and we will work in with government and we'll work in with all the right people to make sure that we have a sustainable industry free of speculators and free of spruikers. So that's where regulation comes in government. So listen to us on that. You've got my email address. Email me. I've had some productive conversations with Treasury around that recently. So it's just important that we understand. And then I absolutely, there is not a silver bullet for housing affordability. It's a problem around every big city in the world, not just our two big cities. Every generation. So, you need this suite of ideas, and I look forward to seeing what the government presents on budget night around that, and we'll talk to that post-budget.
Well said, mate, and well done on your efforts for going into battle for the property investors. I do know you've been in Sydney a fair bit talking to the ministers. You've taken a few punches, but you're trying to throw a few back.
There was a few things that come across my desk which panicked me a little bit, to be honest, but I'm not going to scare. You just know that, hopefully there's more smarter level heads out there that understand that this needs to be a very, very slow process, a gradual process, because of the wave, the contagion effect that it could cause. So, the smart people know that.
Well said. Been a very busy week on the Property Couch, Ibis. This week we've had a bonusode where I was chatting with Kevin. We've got this one today and tomorrow. I think we'll do a Q&A day tomorrow, mate. It's a nice little gentle way into
beautiful
Easter. So, but we thought this was a topic that needed to be chatted about. So there you go, folks. If you have any queries, let us know. Go to info@thepropertycouch if you want to ask any questions that Ben might be able to read out in the next couple of weeks. We'd be happy to answer those.
Totally.
But I normally say until next week, but mate, until tomorrow.
See you later.
See you later.